Order, and welcome to today's Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee hearing on the government's draft updates to the national policy statements for energy infrastructure. And our first panel is with us, and I will ask you to introduce yourselves. We start on my left, please. Hello.
Hello, I'm Jackie Copley. I work for CPRE as a campaigns lead. I'm a chartered town planner with 30 years experience.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Isobel Morris. I'm the Energy Policy Lead at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. I previously worked in the renewable energy sector and in planning.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sam Richards. I run the campaign Britain Remade, which is a campaign supported by 35,000 people across the country to get Britain building the clean energy, homes and transport links that we need.
Thank you all very much, and welcome. The government's proposed updates endorse several strategic plans currently in development. How should these plans relate to the national policy statements, and to what extent should they influence the assessment of individual projects? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to dive in. So I think firstly, very quickly, it's really important to remember why we are updating these policy statements and why we're here, and the importance of these national policy statements. We currently have the highest industrial energy prices in the world. Why is this? Well, as the ONS set out this week, this is because we are incredibly reliant on expensive imported gas. Gas sets the price for electricity almost all of the time, and we import about half of it. Why are we reliant on imported gas? Because we haven't built enough new energy. It's been 30 years since we built a new nuclear power plant. It takes 13 years to get an offshore wind farm up and running, despite the fact that it actually takes 2 to build them. That 11-year gap is all in planning and grid connection. So the measures in these updated national policy statements are welcome, but we'll discuss in further detail whether they actually do enough to get us building. On the overlap with the SSEP and the CNSP coming forward, clearly at this stage we don't know enough because we don't have those two critical documents. My main apprehension, my main anxiety about the SSEP in particular, so this is the big spatial map that NESO are currently working on, it actually in incredible level of detail, down to I think a sort of like 250 square metre, this playground here needs to have the 80 solar panels. And my anxiety is that if it is so prescriptive about what the future map of the energy system looks like, whether it can override the national policy statements, and whether, if developers are bringing forward plans for a new battery or for a new onshore wind farm that goes beyond what is set out in the SSEP, whether the national policy statement kicks in, or whether the SSEP overrides the presumption in the national policy statement to get building. That's my anxiety.
Okay, well, that's very helpful, and I'll ask Isobel and I'll ask you, Jackie, in a moment. Just in following up on your comments there, Sam, would you recommend that the government remove all references to the strategic plans from the national policy statements until the plans have been finalised?
Yes.
Right, okay. Isobel and Jackie, yes, please.
Yes, so first of all, I just want to be clear that the RSPB recognises that we urgently, very urgently, need more renewable energy, and we need to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy. However, it's really important that we don't make wildlife a scapegoat for the failures of the planning system to deliver renewable energy in time. We need much more resources. The statutory bodies have had really significant cuts to their capacity, and many local authorities only have one planning officer. So, how are they supposed to accommodate an increase in applications? On the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, I think because the documents haven't yet come forward, we support the embedding of the strategic planning documents in principle, because we believe that a strategic and spatial approach is absolutely vital to saving nature when it comes to planning for energy. I think, it's difficult for us to say without the documents having been finalised what they will deliver in terms of environmental impact. I don't share the concerns about the granularity of the documents. My understanding is that they will not be so granular. So I think that they will give a more regional steer. We're science-based and we're pro-planning, essentially, and I think that, we support the embedding of the strategic documents in principle, but with some reservations.
And thank you. Before I move on to you, Jackie, we've heard about the very significant costs and delays of, including from Kitchie hotels and Bat tunnels. What's your sense, Isobel, of what the right balance is to be struck? First of all, I should say we've been working closely to support the development of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan because we recognise the importance of accelerating renewable energy whilst saving wildlife. We are in a climate and nature crisis with 1 in 6 species at risk of extinction from the UK. And because of the scale of forthcoming energy infrastructure development, it is absolutely vital that we embed clear protections for energy within the planning process, for wildlife within the planning process. I think that there are some changes in the new draft statement that take us further away from that strategic planning principle. So there's some inconsistency in the documents between embedding the strategic spatial plans and other aspects of the draft policy document leading towards a more market-led approach, which potentially facilitates the development of nature-protected sites even more, especially in combination with the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Okay, thank you. Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in whether it's a tonal disagreement or whether, not disagreement, but whether there's any substantive disagreement between Sam and maybe Isobel and Jackie around the level of protection needed and the concern around what could happen to wildlife. I mean, Sam, is it just a tonal difference in terms of?
I would say not. I would say that there is a substantial difference. The document. So last year, critical national priority status was introduced for energy infrastructure. As it is written, it overrides protections for sites of special scientific interest. There is new wording in the draft NPS which further embeds that and actually notes that, for instance, mitigation measures that would reduce the generating capacity of a new site won't be considered acceptable. That's the implication of the document. And actually for some things, so for instance, at our own turbine, at RSPB HQ, we have mitigation measures in place. So we pause the turbine for a very brief period at the times of day when bats and birds are most active. And for some wind farms in particular, that is a crucial part of mitigation measures. So the new draft policy steers us further away from being able to take those mitigations, which are absolutely vital to saving some of these species that are at risk of extinction.
So I would agree with Isobel that there is a substantive difference between us. I do not think that our current framework of environmental protections is fit for purpose. It is worth remembering that all of our key biodiversity indicators are in decline under the current framework of protections. 40% of SSSIs are in unfavourable conditions. This is despite the fact that them being designated SSSIs and also SACs. We have various different types of site designation, some inherited from the EU, some not. Some in statute, some not. Our system of protected sites is an absolute mess and needs wholesale reform. And we need to move to a system whereby it is both much easier to build the clean energy that we need to tackle climate change, by the way, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, and also where we have proper protections and we are funneling private cash into restoring nature and restoring habitats.
Let's move on because Jackie, you haven't had a say yet.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. So CPRE very much supports action on net zero, and we think actually the government's been dragging its heels by not having already brought in a future home standard that requires features such as rooftop solar, heat pumps, electric vehicle charging points, and we're pleased to see that you're consulting on that. In the evidence I've provided already, CPRE had hoped strategic documents such as the land use framework would be available, and we did a piece of work with Aldersgate UK to show that we do need a new approach, and we welcome that NESO is progressing a strategic spatial energy plan. In fact, we are liaising with it on its visual societal forum. There is very much a value to have clear and transparent planning that does engage people effectively. We're concerned that if you go too quick with pressures on the environment, that's landscape and ecology, causing further degradation to, as Sam has already said, and Isobel, a very degraded natural capital. You know, we're in a lot of danger, and frankly, the proposals in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill don't give us any confidence. You've got your own Office of Environmental Protection warning you that if you continue, you are going to have degraded environment. So really, we need to progress. We need the energy infrastructure to enable people to choose more low-carbon lifestyles, but we need to do it in a joined-up way. So strategic planning always has strategic documents that are in the process of being refined. Local plans still have to get progressed, even though at the national level, the National Planning Policy Framework is subject to change. So I think we'd encourage you to move forward with the national policy statements and keep the references in. I think you need to keep the references into those context documents because they will be finalised soon.
And just to clarify then, what's your view on front-loading strategic decisions out of the planning system? Do you think that undermines or could undermine the response to environmental and indeed local concerns?
I think we've said we need to, it's the framing. The public, in order to have public support, broad public support for net zero actions, yes, you need to set out what the need is, but there has to be those safeguards in place so as development is brought forward. NSIPs are of a national importance. The kind of scale of impact you get is worthy of an examination, and you do need to understand that you're getting a positive planning balance at the end of it. And if you're not, it shouldn't be consented. So by all means set out the strategic direction, but really you need to have a proper development consent order examination to understand. Because, for example, if a project was going to come forward but it had little prospect of being connected to the grid.
Okay, so final question from me before I move on. We don't have a huge amount of time for all the things we need to get to. No, it's not. It's not awful. So this is very quickly from all three of you, I think. You still see the importance of local authorities in examining planning applications. You don't want to see strategic energy infrastructure being taken out of that system entirely.
I would say there needs to be local authority input, particularly now you're getting a new devolved combined authority structures.
Right. Anything different from Isobel?
I just wanted to add to that. Actually, I think it's a really important point that also, if we take all decision making away from the communities in which the infrastructure is going to be located, in the medium term, we risk seriously undermining public trust and public acceptance in the energy transition. And I think that that's something that's currently being lost in the discourse around this subject.
Okay.
So, yes, there should be some local input, but we shouldn't be allowing a vociferous minority of vested interests to veto the energy that the majority want and need, and indeed that democratically elected ministers want to see built.
Just to challenge that, I'd like to understand the evidence. It's very difficult for local communities to stop a nationally significant infrastructure project. It would only happen if there was something unlawful, such as harm to irreplaceable habitat, which I think we'd all agree, irreplaceable habitat needs to be safeguarded. So I think it's an exception rather than the rule, and I think really, in any case, planning has been misaligned, as have these so-called blockers and nature. It's not that at all. If you look, it's the market behind energy infrastructure The only reason Sellafield, for example, hasn't had new infrastructure is because South Korean company Toshiba backed out of undertaking it. So really, the whole narrative of government blaming people who just care about either the countryside or ecology is really misaligned. I think there needs to be a correction.
Well, I mean, Jackie raises the role of vexatious judicial reviews. It is the case now that a majority of infrastructure projects that the government is trying to get built are brought through the courts. I think it's 60%. And the Prime Minister, at the start of this year, raised the example of an offshore wind farm, I think it was the Boreas offshore wind farm off the top of my head, that after filling out 6,000 planning documents, not one 6,000-page document, 6,000 documents, including an environmental impact assessment running into tens of thousands of pages. These environmental impact assessments, by the way, are great news for planning lawyers, but do very little actually for nature restoration. But after doing these 6,000 documents, it still faced a judicial review, which it then overcame, as most of these are ultimately. So I wouldn't necessarily hold up saying, well, if they're breaking the law, then therefore it must necessarily be a project that can't go ahead. The system is currently stymied, as well as by the difficulty of getting grid connections for clean energy, the failures of our environmental impact assessments to properly protect nature and also let us build, by vexatious legal claims. And that is actually a really key point for these documents, for these policy statements, but I'll let the check continue.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are going to move on because my colleagues have got lots of questions and we've only got till 10:30 for this panel. So Claire Young, you're going to take over now.
Okay, so thank you, Chair. A stated aim of the amendments to planning policy for critical national priority infrastructure is to ensure that the national importance of these projects is considered whilst encouraging higher quality applications. Do you think the amendments could encourage higher quality applications despite the presumption of consent? Jackie, this one?
Well, I think the CPRE is all for better quality applications and probably a shortening of applications too, because I think we've all experienced examinations where you have the last one I was at had 28,000 pages to go through, which is obviously a lot, and when you actually look at what was coming out, critical national priority is important to support decision takers when they're in that consenting process.
I'd just like to come back here to the role of strategic planning. So, I think that the Windsor report a few years back now recommended that we move towards this more strategic approach to planning, and that's why these strategic planning documents are being developed. Why did we move towards strategic planning? Because there are the approach to site selection that we have had so far is very market-led, and if you remove the incentives from developers to choose sites that are best on environment, best on community impacts, then you actually end up blocking the planning system by encouraging projects that are poorly planned. You are effectively incentivising poor planning, which is what then leads to a small minority, and it is a very small minority, of applications then causing issues in the planning system. I mean, the Office for Environmental Protection, the government's own impact assessment on the Planning and Infrastructure Bill found there is little to no evidence that environmental considerations are a serious blocker in the planning system. The problem is resources. And I think, just to come back around the point on environmental impact assessments, I mean, for some offshore wind farms, we're talking hundreds of square miles here. The public would want to see the infrastructure that is being built. They'd want to see that having a rigorous examination, and that is important for environmental impact assessments as a part of environmental impact assessments. And it's the same for nuclear power stations. These are really major pieces of infrastructure that can have very serious consequences if they go wrong, and the public would would want scrutiny of those developments to be thorough.
If I can ask Sam, the government believes these updates will discourage repeated consultation and drive environmental statements to be proportionate and focused. Will this prevent delays to projects which are a critical national priority?
So as I say, it's worth thinking about, it's worth breaking down where those delays come from. Part of it is in the environmental impact assessments, and don't take it from me, I know that I'm sure you'll be speaking to the renewable sector and you'll be speaking to the nuclear industry, both of whom can speak at length to the delays that those cause to the process. But those aren't really covered by this. That will be dealt with separately in the planning bill and the changes in the introduction of EDPs. You then also have grid connections, which, again, in that I said it takes 13 years to get an offshore wind farm up and running, 11 years in planning. About 3 or 4 years of that is environmental impact assessments, 4 or 5 years is the delay getting a grid connection, and the presumption of overhead grid, which we will come to, and the other bits on grid in here, alongside the work that the government is doing to remove zombie projects from the queue, will be critical in speeding up the grid. And then finally, there is this chunk around judicial review, and this is where I am concerned that there are some hostages to fortune in the policy statement that could provide a way in for often well-meaning, but also sometimes vexatious lawsuits that delay projects. So there is a particular, in the policy presumption for the critical national priority language, as it stands, it says that in general, adverse impacts will not be a sufficient basis for refusing consent. Having discussed this issue with a prominent infrastructure lawyer, my understanding is that that could provide a basis for judicial review in certain cases, delaying critical projects. So it is worth, I'm sure that you will be, but it is worth the committee as well, almost red teaming this with some planning lawyers and going line by line and saying, where are the points here whereby judicial reviews could be brought against projects that are approved on grounds that are set out in the national policy statements?
Sorry, Claire, just to step in for a minute. Aren't your concerns about or to what extent are your concerns about judicial review covered in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill?
Well, so the Planning and Infrastructure Bill will reduce the opportunity for judicial review from 3 bites of the cherry to 1.5, really. But there will still be. The chance is not that of course, we shouldn't remove the opportunity for judicial review. There will still be the chance for that. And the problem, my anxiety is with some of the clauses in EN1, but also 3 and 5, is that there are hostages to fortune in there that could be used by those who wish to delay projects, sometimes for well-meaning reasons, sometimes less so.
Jackie, did you want to come in quickly?
Yeah, I think the government, in being socially responsible, has to bring forward net zero projects at speed, but it also needs to make sure, because the two are involved, we need to protect our environment, because where we have degraded peat or harms occurring, it's actually counterproductive because you're actually accelerating the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere, and we're all dependent on nature for survival. So there has to be balanced decision-taking. Fair enough to set the urgent priority of net zero projects, but there does have to be a proper examination, and you do have to do your surveys. When we left the European Union, we were promised the same standard or better, and what I'm concerned about is we're going to be having infrastructure projects advanced, possibly by French-owned companies, in a situation where we're getting a less protected environment than they have. So we'll end up with a degraded, not necessarily even getting the best of the infrastructure, because at this point in time we don't have that strategic oversight to understand where the locations, and because at the moment we think there's an over-planning, there's a lot of grid connections of which we won't actually need if we waited.
I'm conscious of time, so if I can move on to Isobel, the presumption of consent for critical national priority infrastructure has been criticised for removing the incentive to avoid ecologically sensitive sites. Is this a necessary consequence of the policy achieving its objective, or could any improvements be made?
I think that the aspects of critical national priority status that remove environmental protections and override environmental protections should be removed. I think that critical national priority status is important. However, we shouldn't forget that actually ecosystem restoration is also a vital part of meeting our climate targets, and isn't that why we're doing this in the first place? And this makes it, these policies make it difficult to do that.
Let's move on to the next.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you.
I'll start with Jackie again on this one. Do you support the new policy that if measures to mitigate environmental impacts cause a material reduction in the electricity generation capacity of renewables, they're unlikely to be appropriate?
As said before, I think everything has to be taken in balance, but the object of the NPSs is to progress net zero actions. So I could see it would be unlikely to cause a reduction in generation power.
I think the question is it's saying that if measures to mitigate the environmental impacts do cause a material reduction, then they're not likely to be appropriate, which...
Yeah, that's right. I think ultimately we need some assurance that if projects are going to go ahead, there will be some, using the mitigation hierarchy, you try to avoid, and if you can't establish those gains on site, you have to look at a package of compensatory measures elsewhere. And if that is dictated with local nature recovery strategies and through the new environmental fund, I think there would be some confidence. But you're probably aware that the Royal Town Planning Institute recently published a study on environmental mitigations to show that there's been a lack of enforcement. So again, if you're going to go down that route, there'd have to be some safeguarding to make sure there was enough resources with either stakeholders such as Natural England and also local authorities to make sure any agreed compensations actually did happen.
Okay. Isobel.
Thank you for letting me come back in here. So I just want to give a more illustrative example of what this might look like in practice. So, many of our seabird species are on a pathway to extinction. The UK hosts the majority for some of these species. Now, say you have an offshore wind farm where you've got a very large site covering hundreds of square miles, and then a corner of that wind farm is found to be crossing a key feeding route, a route for say, puffins, which are on a pathway to extinction, to go from their nesting grounds to their feeding grounds. Now, what you might try to do at the moment is remove that corner of the wind farm, which might only take a small amount of capacity out of the wind farm, or you might try to rearrange the turbines and move them somewhere else, or put measures in place such as pausing them and using radar technology. You can use radar and cameras now to help with mitigation and pausing the turbines for very short periods of time. So what this would do is effectively discourage those mitigation measures from occurring. So you might be able to just remove a very small amount of capacity and actually make quite a big difference to the impact on the environment. And this policy discourages you from doing that. So this policy would effectively say, don't move the turbines or don't remove 2 or 3 of them, or put mitigations in place that would stop the killing and the displacement of seabirds.
Thank you.
Isn't the counter-argument, though, that developers won't go ahead and therefore we won't see the expansion of renewables and we'll be stuck with fossil fuel generation, which is going to do far more damage?
Well, I think that we need a marine spatial plan to help us identify the best sites for offshore wind and for wildlife, so that we can effectively plan the use of our seabed to protect 30% of our seas, as we have committed at an international level to doing. We've committed to protecting 30% of our seas for nature. And then we need to choose the best sites for offshore wind as well. So I think that there is room for all of the offshore wind that we need and for nature in the sea, but we have to take a strategic and spatial approach to planning for it.
So on the back of that, if I can ask Sam, should the policy be reframed to allow more flexibility and clarify when maximising generation or achieving specific conservation objectives will take precedence?
I think more clarity would help, and as I say, I'm concerned that some of the clauses in here are sufficiently vague that they open up routes for blockages. So in EN5, I think it's 2.11.1, says that where biodiversity impacts are identified, the Secretary of State should be satisfied that all feasible options have been considered and evaluated appropriately. Now, that to me sounds like a route whereby, again, well-meaning conservation groups will say to the Secretary of State, actually, you haven't properly evaluated this potential mitigation route. We're going to need another year of delay. We're going to need another year of surveys. We're going to need another year of thinking about this project. And then, off the back of it, as normally happens, the report will be produced. No money will actually go into nature restoration, but a box will have been ticked. We're a year further down the line, a year further away from our targets, another year of high energy bills. So, yes, I think greater clarity in some of the drafting of this would be welcome. But just again, to make this core point again, so Jackie made the argument that we should retain the same environmental standards as the European Union, and Isobel went on to say that a quarter of our seabirds are facing extinction. They are facing extinction under those current standards. All of our key biodiversity indicators, farmland birds to insect life, as NGOs will consistently tell us, are consistently in decline and have been for decades under the current framework. It is surely possible, and indeed more than possible, necessary to devise a new approach to environmental regulation, as indeed the government is looking to deliver through the planning bill, that is more strategic, that front-loads some of these concerns, that allows us both to build the green energy we need to tackle climate change and also funnel more private money into nature restoration.
But if I may be so bold, as I mentioned before, the RTPI has mentioned 39% of trees agreed not planted, 75% of bird and bat boxes not installed, 100% of invertebrate boxes in the wrong place, 83% of hedgehog highways not provided. And that's to do with resourcing of the system. So you can't have it both ways. That is happening already under a system that's effectively broken. And I think let's talk up the value of planning, and let's talk up the value of doing environmental assessments properly and having a bit more due regard to what are the outcomes. We need both, and I don't think we necessarily need to be pitting ourselves against us. Let's just deliver both, and I think the government's got it in its power to do it by bringing in these MPSs. They need to be done, but there needs to be scrutiny, DCO examination, because without that, you lack transparency, and I think you do lose the public with you. The danger is, already, for example, the very large mega solar are causing stress to local communities when you've got tenanted farms being evicted against promises. Best and most versatile land is being focused upon. I've provided a reference to, if you just look at the renewable energy database, you can see it, our fenlands, and that's to do, it's a legacy of our coal-fired power station, that there's capacity on the east coast, and that's why new energy types are being focused there. But actually, new energy and grid upgrade should be focused on existing settlements to allow them to take advantage of renewables. There's no point in connecting up remote countryside, because in a way you're setting up future generations to fail. We're already in a situation where we import 50% of our foodstuffs. Climate change means 60% of our most prime agricultural land is at threat from flooding. So we really need the land use framework to identify which bits of farmland should we be retaining, how we're going to achieve our 30% of land and sea protected for ecology, and enable that strategic oversight. So I think we're getting there, and of course these NPSs will need to be regularly refreshed to keep track of change, but we're just in a situation where public confidence in the planning and infrastructure bill is very low, because anybody who's ever been involved in ecological assessments can see you're removing the public consultation stage from the beginning of the NSIP process, and then you're minimising the ability to do a judicial review. And I don't think accepted vexatious judicial review applications shouldn't be allowed, agreed. But actually, I'm a big advocate of planning, because I think it's a method of mediating what the local concerns are, and you can address them through change of site location or design and mitigation. And I've been involved in many examinations where it's not been about stopping a development, it's just about getting better outcomes.
Okay, if I can just move quickly to Isobel. Beyond simply mitigating environmental impacts, should the NPS focus more upon using strategic planning to integrate conservation into design and construction of new energy infrastructure?
Yes, I think we would support that in principle. Obviously, we'd need to see the document, the wording of any revised draft before agreeing to that. But yes, that is something we would support in principle, because we do need more renewable energy. But, you know, we also need to not make wildlife a scapegoat and not trash the environment for future generations. I mean, that's why we have our climate targets in the first place. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was actually EN3, the new draft policy statement with the section on onshore wind. So I mentioned we have our own turbine. We really support onshore wind, and we want to see more onshore wind in England. We're glad the ban was reversed. However, you know, as I think it's really important to be aware, for the committee to be aware, that so there are a lot of our upland areas in England where it's quite windy have peat on them, and we actually have a target to restore 80% of our peat for climate targets by 2050. That's the Climate Change Committee's recommendation. 80% of our peatland should be restored by 2050. And, you know, this policy, the way it is written, disincentivises developers from choosing the best quality peatland sites. So we have some sites where you have several metres depth of peat, where, you know, it's a protected, internationally recognised site as being internationally important habitat and really important for the peat quality itself. And when you build in it, you change the ability of the peat to absorb water and therefore make it more likely that it will dry out and emit carbon. So I think it's really important I want to take a closer look at the policy and the way it's worded. The way it's worded at the moment is it suggests that windiness should be the primary factor above all else, even if we need that peat for restoring, for peatland restoration as part of our other climate targets. Well, you can't replace it once it's been destroyed. So, I think
How do you generate wind energy if you don't go to where it's windy?
There are lots of windy areas where there isn't peat. There are lots and lots of windy areas where there isn't peat. So we published research last year that found you could build the solar and onshore wind that we need for climate targets using just 2.6% of UK land. So it absolutely is achievable with a strategic approach to planning. However, we
and where are these places?
Well, so we mapped the country. We steered development away from ecologically important areas, and we also steered it away from the most productive agricultural land. And we found that you could still build more than what we actually need for the Climate Change Committee recommended
and that
pathways.
Works for the developers. It works for the connection to the grid. It works for the country's needs.
I think it works best for the public, and I think that is, ultimately what we're all here for, isn't it? What delivers for the public, what delivers for the public's interest in the short and long term.
I'll just go back to. Are you familiar with what Isobel's proposing there?
I haven't seen the details of this report. I mean, I would say that one area that we haven't explored so far is new nuclear, and we know that nuclear is incredibly energy dense. If we didn't have Hinkley coming on the grid, we would need a solar farm the size of the Isle of Wight or an onshore wind farm the size of the New Forest. I'm all for more renewables, but there is a risk, and this is more the focus of the policy of Clean Power 2030 than necessarily these planning statements. But these policy statements, obviously, with their focus on CP 2030, there is a risk that they kick new nuclear into the long grass, and it is,
there won't be any new nuclear before 2030.
No, indeed. Well, other than, Hinkley will be completed, but yeah.
Well, hopefully the first reactor, yes, indeed. Right, we'll move on. Torquil Crichton.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you all for coming in. I've got some questions on pylons, on turbines, and I guess on bats and birds as well. To have this transition, we're going to have to build a lot of pylons everywhere, and a lot of people are going to see them. And as I understand it, the presumption is that it will be pylons outside national parks and underground inside national parks and areas of outstanding national beauty. Jackie, this presumption of pylons everywhere, is it right? Does the current guidance on the national policy statement capture the considerations that have to be taken into account?
Well, I think CPRE does support the electricity transmission design principles in addition to the Holford, which is the routing of pylons, and the Horlock rules relating to the siting of other infrastructure like substations. We recognise Clean Power Commissioner Nick Windsor identified there were issues previously in terms of how the rules of the guidance were interpreted, leading to different outcomes. So I've had a look through EN5, which relates to pylons, and I think we are supportive of necessary pylons, but yeah, if they avoid protected landscape, that's great, and elsewhere it would benefit from having landscape sensitivity assessments to understand broad locations within geographies that are more acceptable than otherwise. We have got a few concerns. For example, our group in Derbyshire, they were trying to get a new route down the M1 corridor, because that was obviously a landscape that had already been impacted, rather than going across a valley in Erewash that currently has no other man-made intrusion. So it seems a shame that their preferred route was to go through a green valley rather than along a motorway corridor. So we're always going to have issues like that, but broadly the rules that have been set out we're agreeing with.
Isobel, where are the RSPB in this? Because the RSPB say overhead lines will affect bats and bird population, underground will dig up hedgerows and bushes like that. Where do you stand?
So we recognise the urgency of delivering new electricity infrastructure as a really important part of the energy transition and getting to net zero. We recognise that we need this infrastructure. What we want, again, is a strategic and spatial approach that ensures that the environment, that ecologically sensitive areas are prioritised as areas to avoid for new infrastructure. And also sometimes you do need site-specific mitigations in place. So in some instances, for instance, if you are building infrastructure near a wetland where there are lots of birds that are prone to colliding with pylons, you might want to put those pylons underground. In other instances, you might want to put them overhead because there are, important and rare fungi, for instance, in the soil. So, it's a site-specific policy overall that we have, but supporting in principle.
Okay, Sam, all those costs?
Yeah, I think there's...
Costs to put stuff underground? It costs
loads to put stuff underground,
yeah. It's 100 million to protect bats from HS2.
Yeah.
Is all this stuff, to quote Steve Reed, and pardon my language, is it batshit crazy to start protecting the environment?
I think the language in the policy statement that references the significant additional cost from undergrounding is absolutely right. There's a report out just this week by the IET about that demonstrated that undergrounding cables costs 4 to 5 times more than it does doing them through pylons. So the presumption of pylons here is absolutely right. And just to remake the point that I did previously, obviously we will need loads more pylons as a result of the shift to a majority renewables grid, where energy is of course much more dispersed and much more diffuse. And we would need fewer if we had more large-scale nuclear power plants.
Okay, Jackie, just quickly, there are costs the other way as well. People say it's going to cost, in terms of tourism, lost tourism revenue, right, or lost agricultural ground. Yeah. There's a balance.
So two things. I was going to push back on the quote in the paper about it being tenfold cost. I think it's because we don't do it enough. If you look at Denmark in 2008, they decided to underground all their new infrastructure. And guess what? They've got the most energy secure supply because they never have outages, and they're also benefiting from clean energy. So if we did more undergrounding, the cost of doing it would come down, and in any case, it's more like 4 to 5 rather than 10 times the cost. But you're right, England is known for its wet weather in the summers. Why do people go on holiday here? It is because it's attractive landscapes, people have an affinity to it, and want to spend time at weekends and the rest of it. So yes, there will be harm to the visitor economy if you degrade our landscapes unnecessarily. And I think that's the point, is that whether it's necessary or not, and there are choices here. So, you know, there are, as well as undergrounding, there's use of different types of pylons that can reduce impact, such as T-pylons. So, you know, I think we're all for looking at good engineering solutions, and probably we can support our own industrial strategy by having some UK well-designed, well-engineered products that we can utilise.
Yes, Sam, I know you want your question to come in, but let's make it quick.
Just very quickly, very quickly, can I just...
Can I just pick up on what you're saying there, Jackie? I have people who complain about the removal of hedgerows in my constituency. Laying underground cables involves moving hedgerows and disturbing species as well. And by the way, I should declare my interest as a member of the CPRE, having forgotten to do it earlier. How do you address that challenge? You seem to have a problem whether you have pylons or underground cables.
It's all to do with scales, isn't it? How many metres of hedgerow is going to be impacted? How old is it? Is it significant under the 1997 hedgerow regulations? That would be a matter for a examination in the same way any other planning application gets decided. Planning is a test. You set out what your strategic aims and objectives are, and then when applications come in, you read that against what your strategic aims and objectives are, and if it accords with it, even accepting some harms, it will be consented, but it depends on the severity of the harms always.
Sorry, Joel, carry on.
That's fine. You wanted to come in very quickly, Sam. I want to move on to pylons, so we can make it quick.
Very quickly, I mean, just to say, when we built the world's first coal-fired power station, we did not worry about undergrounding the lines. We got incredibly rich as a country. We were the richest country in the world as a result of building stuff, and we have gotten relatively poorer as a result of not building that stuff. We shouldn't be making it harder and more expensive for ourselves to produce our own energy.
Message received on that. Jackie, much of the opposition to pylons is the same as the opposition to turbines, and now we're going to have more onshore turbines in England. It's mostly, I'm not against wind farms, but just not here.
Well,
is the guidance sufficient in that?
I think it is actually. I've looked at the detail of EN5, and there are an awful lot of references to environmental mitigation, and that includes the approach to the landscape. We, of course, would flag the Landscape Institute's GLIVIA, which is the guidance on landscape and visual impact assessments. So when you're looking at your options for grid connections, you avoid protected landscapes, and thereafter you understand, as Isobel was saying, you can have grid connections. That most engineers prefer A to B because it's the cheapest, most quickest and most efficient way of doing it. However, National Grid are good at talking to local groups, RSPB, CPRE, and where there is, say, a triple SI or other protected ecology, they will route around. It is doable, and it's not that costly given the environmental gains. And by the way, when I'm in these forums, often developer consultants will come and speak to me and say, we would do that if we were required to do it. The only reason we don't is because we're not legally obliged to do it, and we're reporting to shareholders. So I think you'll find not just the public, but most people involved in the built and natural environment sectors are supportive of this type of way of planning.
Okay, can I ask you the same question about solar farms? We've heard that the guidance is confusing. It's not equivocal about where exactly solar farms should be placed and if they're placed in the best places.
Yeah, I think I mentioned before. I think a land use framework would help. So, by the way, CPRE did a report, Shout from the Rooftops. We based, I've incorrectly said University of Central London. It's obviously University College London in my evidence, but. That identified there was enough wasted space for 117 gigawatts of installed solar using rooftops, car parks and other brownfield sites. However, even in that report, because of the speed at which it would take to get rooftops installed, we do recognise that we do need some ground mounted in the short term, and those locations ought to again be advised through either a land use framework and proper environmental assessments. We cannot keep losing best and most versatile land, and we shouldn't be turfing tenanted farmers who've worked the land for generations without due course. However,
That's happening. I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah, and, North Malton, there was a case recently where the Secretary of State overruled a inspector's decision, and sadly, a 3-generation farm lost half the land, so the farm was no longer viable. And we're seeing that happen elsewhere. And I do think the government's vulnerable on that. We shouldn't be putting farm business out of business needlessly. But we do recognise for some farmers, diversifying and having modest amounts of solar would be a way forward. But in the first instance, we'd like them to harness roof space.
Okay, thank you. Isobel, when I hear the RSP's support for wind energy, it sounds very qualified. It sounds like objections lots of people have. I support renewables, but, or however. And you've strongly criticised the way the government's guidance for onshore wind farms and addresses the biodiversity and ecological considerations. Outline to me again what your main concerns are about onshore wind.
Our main concerns about onshore wind. So I want to be really clear.
And offshore wind as well. Yeah.
And offshore wind. So I want to be clear, we do support the need for more renewables. I think that the challenge with delivering them so far, a key issue has been the resourcing. There are some challenges, like with all types of infrastructure, in terms of how you deliver for the environment, and for wind, those obviously are often related to birds and bats. However, I think that we work with developers in partnership to advise them on how to deliver for nature at sites. We've recently published research showing that solar farms can have higher population of birds than surrounding farmland when they're well planned and well managed. And we work to support Scottish Power on Whiteley Wind Farm, the UK's biggest wind farm, and we worked on some of the biodiversity measures there. So, we are really keen to support onshore wind and offshore wind, but because they do have specific impacts related to birds and to bats, it is really, really important that good mitigations are in place, particularly given the very critical state of some of the populations that those might have an effect on. And we're talking about, for seabirds, for instance, we're talking about 42% decline in kittiwake in the last 20 years. That means, they are very much on a pathway to going extinct. And if we don't
Not because of turbines, though, because of other environmental impacts.
Offshore wind is one factor, unfortunately. So we have to have the mitigations in place. Offshore wind it's like adding an extra pressure on top of all the other pressures that are already there. And so that's why mitigations are really important, because these structures are going to be in place in the decades to come when we actually need to be restoring these populations.
Yeah. You give a very good kind of illustrative example of puffins' flight paths. And I just wondered, do we need more data like that? Is there data like that? Is there data to show that wind farms do affect bird populations?
Yes, there is data, but we need more. We need more data to understand where the animals are going when they're out at sea. We need much more data on that. We do have some data, and that has been one of the issues so far, is that when some of our first wind farms came forward, we didn't have as much data as we have now. And so we are now in a much better place to do marine spatial planning, but we do need a marine spatial plan. And that's also an important for the international commitments that we've made to restoring ecosystems as well, which are vital. That the Climate Change Committee does say that is absolutely vital for our climate change targets, ecosystem restoration.
You said something very interesting about local planning earlier on, and how kind of under-resourced local planning is. Is there a case for a kind of planning flying squad to go from area to area to back up local councils, and also the same way in terms of an environmental task force, sort of a more holistic approach to this?
I think that's a really interesting idea, and we're open to innovation. We're open to ideas. We do need more funding for the statutory body. So Natural England has had a 45% cut in its core aid funding between 2014 and 2020. And Tony Juniper in 2020 noted in a letter to the then Environmental Audit Committee chair that actually that's had a really significant impact on their ability to turn around advice on time. Given that we need 3 to 5 times more develop applications to come forward in the next few years and to be approved, how is Natural England and how are local authorities supposed to deliver the advice that's needed with the current resources that they have? I don't see how that's possible. And I think that has been a really... When you talk to industry, when I work regularly on a day-to-day basis with people in the industry, they talk all the time about the resource in the statutory bodies and in local authorities being a key problem.
Thank you. Sam, last word. Is the country's love of birds getting in the way of the country's need to save the planet?
Isobel, I'm sure, will know better than I, but my understanding is that your average British bird is orders of magnitude more likely to be killed by flying into a building, a car, or being eaten by a domesticated cat than it is by a bird strike from a wind turbine.
Thank you all.
Challenge that.
Just to say, there isn't. I think that's missing an important point here, which is that it is certain species in key areas, rather than we're not talking about urban birds here that are at risk from turbines. We're talking about much really rare species and species at risk of extinction. So.
Thank you all.
Although my cats wouldn't distinguish between the two, I hate to admit. Just finally from me, before we thank you and let you go on your way, back to pylons and grid infrastructure. Sam, just quickly to clarify, you were talking about the importance of nuclear in the ability of it to reduce the expansion of new pylons. Can you just confirm that would require a big upgrade in the existing grid network, and whether there are implications there for the discussion we've been having?
Yeah, you clearly still need new grid to connect new nuclear power plants to the grid, and it needs to be reinforced. But if you had more nuclear power, which is much more energy dense, you require much less distributed networks. But we need both. We need lots more renewables, and we're going to need lots more nuclear power in order to get our bills down, in order to feed AI, and in order to tackle the climate crisis.
Okay, that's helpful. And then the role that we touched on this very briefly, the role that transport corridors could play as being the place to put new grid capacity. Jackie, do you want to just...
It's just when weighing up the options, clearly roads differ. For example, the Snake Pass connecting Sheffield and Manchester, you wouldn't necessarily want a pylon going along the route of that, but along a motorway corridor or a dual carriageway, it might be the more sensible place to put it.
Have you done any analysis, or can you quote any studies that show how feasible this might be?
As I say, our Derbyshire group did look at the differences, the different options of routing it. So I can ask them if they have evidence that I can pass on to you. But we also have evidence from Green in the Andy Tickle wrote a report for counties of Suffolk, Norfolk and Kent, I think, giving advice on options for grid infrastructure there. It was linked to the Tilbury line. Yeah,
of course there are limited trunk roads.
Yeah.
Absence of motorways in...
But it's to do with managing the landscape, isn't it? Understanding what is sensitive and not. But of course, I suppose I ought to refer to cumulative impact as well. That's obviously an area CPRE is concerned. Understanding if there's going to be so much infrastructure coming forward, not just pylons for transmission, but district network, there's a lot to be considered.
Are there similar opportunities with rail?
Yes, probably, absolutely, yeah.
If there is evidence, then we'd be very, very pleased to.
Yeah, I will ask if there is such evidence in the network.
Well, in that case, Jackie, Copley, Isobel Morris and Sam Richards. Thank you very much for your evidence this morning for a very entertaining and interesting session. We will suspend the session while we change over the panels. Order, and welcome back to the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee second panel of the morning on the national policy statements and the government's draft updates for energy infrastructure. Welcome to our second panel. I will start on this side. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Peta Donkin, and I'm here representing the National Infrastructure Planning Association. I'll refer to them as NIPA for brevity throughout the session. I'm a board member and policy and practice lead there.
Thank you. You are very welcome.
Hi there, I'm Gunby from Suffolk County Council. I refer to that as SCC. I'm the National Infrastructure Planning Manager.
Thank you. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm Ali Leeder. I'm a director at Aeos Infrastructure. I'm also on the board of the National Infrastructure Planning Association, and I specialise in DCO consents.
Well, thank you, and you are all very, very welcome. And Graham, you were shaking your head furiously in the last session at a question asked by Torquil Crichton. I wonder if we can start with your reaction to what you heard.
Yeah, I think there was a suggestion that there should be a kind of national planning hit squad, and I think I'd sort of rail against that, really. I think the value that local authorities bring to the discussions at the pre-application stage and afterwards, and during discharge requirements as well for that matter, is the local knowledge. So as you know, we don't receive any fees for dealing with these projects, but we do agree planning performance agreements. And in a recent meeting, one of the questions was, do you use are they in-house technical experts that you employ, or are they consultants? And we said no, they're full-time employees, and well, that's good because they give that local perspective. So I think that's what we can bring to the table. We're dealing with projects, they're national, international entities supported by consultants are in the same position really, and obviously the planning inspectorate are from nationwide, and so I think that's very valuable. And obviously we try to support local communities, including parish councils, and I think it's all part of the picture really. So it kind of brings that local experience that we have now, because we've had over 20 NSIPs in Suffolk, and some of the lessons learnt there, and it enriches the developers' views, but also, some of the early proposals, we welcome early engagement, as we'll probably come on to later, but some of the quite significant changes that we're able to gain from those discussions, they come from local knowledge. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for explaining your reaction earlier. That's very, very helpful, and we will indeed very much value your input. And Torquil Crichton, as you were asking the question.
Yeah, just to assuage your worries, Graham, my suggestion would be that local government be given more resource, not that national government come in and impose its will on local decision making. Just to help deal with these are huge challenges facing local government, kind of getting this transition through. And I just think there should be more backup, more devolved backup from central government to local government. Not that national government should impose its will on local government.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we are slightly under-resourced, or we are under-resourced is probably a better way of putting it. And I think that could be extended to local communities. I mean, I do note, the lowest tier of local government are parish councils, and back in the past they have been able to get money for doing their neighbourhood plans, for instance, and I think that might have been reduced now. But there was a thought at one time that a similar scheme could be available so that they could employ an advocate, a planning advocate, so that they could engage with these proposals. And we've heard about the weight of the applications. I mean, just to put it in context, if we were to consider the normal kind of workload of a county council, 8 districts, 20 years worth of minerals and waste and regulation-free files might, obviously some's archived, might occupy a cupboard. One NSIP would be the whole cupboard, and if it's Sizewell C, it's a whole room. So, and they do, and obviously local communities, you probably heard this yourself, they suffer from consultation fatigue because they've got multiple projects and they need to find resources. And, but at the same time, even at the county council, and no doubt at the district level, just yesterday we were discussing a solar development, and there was criticism from the parishes that I think it was the district hadn't reflected particular concerns around a particular area of a particular village. But in a sense, that is their best place to do that, because they have that very fine grain knowledge, but they do need support to be able to do that. And so I think that's an area that could be looked at as well.
Thank you. We're going to come back to the balance between national and local in the next 45 or 50 minutes. I want to turn now to the national policy statements and the strategic plans that NISO are developing. And perhaps, Peter, you can address this first. What, if any, changes would you make to the government's current drafts to ensure there's a clearer relationship between them?
Very good question. I think the relationship between all of the policy documents is key. We at NIPA would like to see the MPSs take precedent in the hierarchy. They are the overarching policy. And then we would like to see transparency in NISO's selection strategy and the routing strategy to demonstrate that spatial awareness across the nation.
Thank you. And for network upgrades, the updates suggest that NISO's strategic plans will decide the parameters for the final route, and alternatives can no longer be considered. I think this goes back to what you were saying, Graham. Does this render the examination of individual projects effectively meaningless?
I wouldn't say so. So, I mean, if you obviously, I do have a long sort of career in planning, and strategic planning's got a role, so is local planning, so have applications, if you like. And strategic planning, it can be very broad brush. It's about overall need, for instance. It could be minerals, it could be waste, it could be housing numbers, and it's very useful when you get down to a lower level tier plan or a development proposal to have that question effectively answered. But at the same time, if you're going to go that route with strategic planning, you need to have a process where it's open and there's consultation on it. Otherwise, people will be mystified. We've had this in Suffolk where, selection of substation sites is a bit of a mystery. And I think the local communities think it's completely unsatisfactory, and then obviously the developers only really got one connection offer, so they have to kind of follow suit. But I do think you can get the overall routing, or you can get possibly nodes, but you'd have to focus in on that area, even at the strategic level, to kind of reality check it, but you'd still have all the detailed issues in an application at an EIP, which there's lots and lots of issues around the build, the mitigation, the decommissioning. We've heard about mitigation for bird strike and things like that. All those sort of things would still need to be discussed, but it would be a useful thing, but it's got to be an open process.
Okay, Ali.
Yes, I agree with Peter entirely that we need to be clear that the MPSs have primacy, and how those other policy documents will relate to that MPS. Obviously, as set out in the Planning Act, we are determining in line with national policy statements unless a number of provisos are met. And I think that could be clearer in the MPS. I think that could be stated. Yeah. In terms of the need of the projects, I think the previous MPSs we had, I think, were really well drafted in terms of the need of the project. I think perhaps some of the way we've worded, the way government have worded the documents and the strategic framework could call into question that need if you read them sort of in the way that an objector might. So, for example, in places the capacities set out for different technologies are referred to as targets. We understand they're not targets, but I think we need to be careful with that language, because otherwise that starts to call into question any projects that go beyond those capacities, and those capacities are mentioned to 2030, not beyond. We know that projects have a longer than 5-year lifespan. A lot of projects that are coming forward at the moment won't be delivered by 2030. So we just need to bear that in mind when we're looking at the wording of the MPS, and just make sure that we're really clear that we're still establishing that need. In terms of your question on routing, I think there is merit in having documents that are produced that set out broad routing, so that there is a clear understanding of what's coming forward. But again, I think we need to think a bit carefully about how we're wording that. So, for example, there's some text in the MPS that says that projects must be brought forward in the broad parameters of those routes, and I can see that potentially being an issue from both directions. In that, if you have a project, and these tend to be early stage projects when they're going into those kind of strategies, and you go out and you talk to communities and you do your environmental surveys and you find a better route that would perhaps not be in those broad parameters, you wouldn't in any way want to stop that better project from all perspectives coming forward. So I think we just need to think carefully about how we do that. So we give some of the useful information that Graham and others are looking for in terms of reasoning for broad routing, but equally we need to be able to deliver the best projects we can and respond to consultation responses and environmental surveys.
Okay, thank you. And you moving on to the environmental impacts, which we just heard a great deal about in the previous panel. The same applies to community impacts. And should local authorities be able to reject the chosen route in preparation of a strategic plan if on environmental or community grounds? Peter, perhaps I'll ask you first, and then the rest of the panel.
So my background is in environmental impact assessment. I'm an EIA coordinator. That's my bread and butter. I work on infrastructure projects for the last decade. I find that the input from local authorities is incredibly valuable. As Graham said earlier, they understand their patch, they know their area, they know what communities want, they know what's important, what the environmental sensitivities are. And the role of EIA in that is to look at balancing all of those impacts to produce a project that fits well into the environment and isn't unacceptable. So I think, yes, local authorities are incredibly important in that process. As ever with planning, there needs to be a balance, and that does come down to, in these cases, examination, where you would have those cases for either side argued out, appropriately, and then an appropriate decision taken.
They have the power of rejection.
I think that's what the examination is for. You would explore those options. And also the pre-application process is very important in that you wouldn't get to examination with too many outstanding issues. You should get to examination with one or two critical issues that potentially need to be further explored.
Graham, should you or the district be able to reject applications of this nature?
I think that's problematical. I mean, the kind of thinking behind the 2008 Act was to take it out of that domain. I think you'd struggle to get, many proposals through. I mean, I don't want to disenfranchise local authorities, but I do. That is part of the reason for the original Act. And I think, but I do think, welfare, well-being, is, we've looked into that where you've got higher concentration of projects, and it is a real thing. So I think, you certainly should be able to bring those up, as an objection. So it is, it's quite possible that authorities will object and back it up, and I guess it will come back down to what's in the national guidance as to the weight that might be given to that. It's definitely a factor. We've seen it in Suffolk.
So it's a question of how much notice the Secretary of State takes of local responses.
Yes, and that would be, but they would tend to follow the NPS because that's probably the best way of doing it. And I think that's the way to go about it. But just to say, well-being is an issue. When you, for the typical scenarios, if you get a substation in a coastal area, it tends to attract multiple projects, and local communities are somewhat overrun, it does cause a great deal of distress. But my kind of view is that I think if you gave local authorities the power to veto it, you'd get lots of vetoes, and I'm not sure how far what would happen then.
Okay, that's very helpful. Ali, I'm going to move on to a different topic. How well do the updated statements add the guidance needed to clarify and enhance the critical national priority status for low carbon infrastructure policy?
Sorry, how far do they go to enhance the priority?
How far do they go to clarify and enhance the policy? Yeah,
I think the targeted updates are useful. I think the establishment of critical national priority in the previous versions was very useful, actually. And I think one thing I would like to comment on, sort of listening to the previous speakers, is that the wording of the critical national priority text states that the need will outweigh the residual impacts that are not addressed by the mitigation hierarchy. And that's really, really important. What that policy is doing is saying, yes, you look at your projects and you reduce your impacts and you avoid your impacts and you mitigate your impacts and you look at compensation. And then at that point, then the need is unlikely to outweigh the residual impacts. And I think we need to be really careful to understand that, because in my view, you do need to strike a balance between consideration of impacts and proportionality in delivering this urgent infrastructure. And I think the text we've got around critical national priority infrastructure does that. Actually, I think it does strike that balance quite well. And I think there's an additional sentence that was also discussed earlier about measures that result in a material reduction of output are unlikely to be appropriate as mitigation. And I think that word material is very important. It's not saying that no reduction is appropriate mitigation. And that sentence is preceded by a sentence that says applicants should demonstrate all residual impacts are those that cannot be avoided, reduced or mitigated. So again, this sentence is, when you read it in the context of the national policy statement, it's absolutely clear that applicants need to be applying the mitigation hierarchy and doing so in routing as much as in the later stages of design to demonstrate compliance with that policy. It's just that once those things have
Do you think it's possible to quantify what material means?
It's very difficult, and I'm not a lawyer. But I mean, I think as a planning consultant and a consent specialist, you use material in different ways, but it's not a insignificant change, and you would always look at it in the context of what your outcome is. So, how important is your environmental impact? Is this about somebody's view from 300 metres away, or is this about a critical protected species? And these things are obviously different, and you'd need a...
This sounds like an opportunity for people with legal qualifications to make lots of money.
Yes, I mean, the word material is used a lot in planning, so...
A lot of money,
yeah. Yes, I think it would certainly be tested. I mean, in my experience of major infrastructure projects, I think there are already lots of discussions that go on over to what extent a reduction of output is justified due to environmental considerations, and wind turbines are removed from projects because of ecological impacts. Areas of solar panels are removed because of archaeological impacts. That this already goes on, and I think that's just reinforcing.
Yeah, I mean, do you share Sam Richards' concerns that there's still far too much opportunity for judicial review and related legal challenge?
Yes, I do. I think the changes to the judicial review process that are proposed through the Banner Review will mean that project reviews without merit don't proceed further, but I think it's about 60% or 70%, a lot, proceed after that first stage. So there is a lot of delay that happens to major infrastructure projects through judicial review, and yes, I'm not sure we've quite got the right balance on that yet.
That's very helpful, thank you. Graham, you mentioned the pre-application process and its importance before, and perhaps you can say how the guidance for critical national policy projects and how pre-application system will help in the new guidance.
So it's in terms about pre-application consultation. So obviously our concern is if this point's about the change to pre-application consultation. So our concern is that obviously remove of section 42 statutory stage. It's concerning to us. Like I say, we put a great deal of emphasis on pre-application consultation. There's acknowledgement that statutory consultation, it's become it's got, if you do consultation at late stage in the project, as statutory consultation tends to be, it tends to be not massively helpful because it's difficult to get change in the project. Developers have gone down a certain road, and it's very difficult probably for them to change course at that stage. They've invested a lot of time and money in getting to that stage. So that, I guess that's acknowledged. But I think at an earlier stages around optioneering of radically different options, and then the general locational details of the favoured option are still very useful. And I guess I think there's an idea that responsible developers would, even though it might not be statutory responsibility spelt out, would continue to do that. There's also a feeling that there's a kind of an idea that schemes need to come forward close to 2030 to get in the queue. Solar schemes, there's a bit of a kind of a build up of projects in that regard, and how much will they take a kind of least detailed option, a quickest route to application. That's a concern. So whatever happens, I think we've put some comments in respect of the separate to this committee in terms of the amendments that have been put forward. We've made representations that. So we do need to have early sight of applications. 2 years for a large development, 1 for a smaller development, and it needs to be set out very clearly that kind of process does need to happen. And even though it might not be the statutory consultation with the preliminary environmental impact report attached to it, it still needs to be. We still need it, basically.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we've heard that the presumption of consent for critical national priority infrastructure effectively predetermines that such projects should override environmental concerns, and that presumption of consent removes any incentives for developers to avoid ecologically sensitive sites. Peter, what's your view on that analysis?
Thank you. Could I just come back on Graham's point very quickly on that? Because I fully agree that we need more guidance now that statutory consultation and the preliminary environmental information report will be effectively disappearing from the process. But what we do need is guidance, but we don't need enough restrictive guidance that we're back to where we were in having to do statutory consultation and produce a PIR. The PIR, the preliminary environmental information report, they are lengthy, they are almost a full environmental statement, and to meaningfully engage with communities, local authorities and other stakeholders, sometimes, as Graham said, that is a room full of information, and actually what we ought to be doing is targeting that information to deliver positive outcomes and get some really meaningful feedback from communities and local authorities. So I would support more thought on that and more guidance and more consultation on how that would go, and NIPA would support that. In terms of the critical national priorities,
presumption of consent,
and the presumption of consent, I think the changes there have been really helpful to date. We do need energy schemes, we need infrastructure schemes in this country, and so that is very helpful to us. But I am very mindful, and we are very mindful, that there are balances to be found, and a project in the right place is the right project, and environmental considerations do need to be taken into account. So above all else, it's very important that all of those are balanced in the decision-making process.
Thank you. And Ali, what's your view on presumption of consent?
Yes, I mean, I think sort of coming back to the wording, I'm not sure that's what that wording delivers. I think the policy is still very clear that you do need to apply the mitigation hierarchy prior to that presumption applying. And of course the Planning Act, sort of section 104, that sets out how you make decisions on applications, says that applications should be determined in line with the national policy statements unless 5 provisos apply, and that includes a proviso on the adverse impacts outweighing the benefits. How that plays out with CMP policy we haven't yet really seen. And it also does include provisos on international obligations. So I think I understand where the interpretations come from, but I think when it's actually applied to the regime, I think those environmental protections are still there. It's just that they do need to be balanced with the very urgent need for a nationally significant infrastructure.
Okay, so would you encourage a redrafting to reflect what you've just said?
In my view, that's what the drafting says. Okay. And that's
because the evidence we've had is that it doesn't. So you're happy with it? Okay.
Yes, I support the current drafting.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you, Chair. So if I can start with Peter. As you'll know, the government's using the Planning Infrastructure Bill to remove statutory pre-application consultation requirements. To implement this effectively, what further guidance do you want to see in the national policy statements?
Great question, thank you. NIPA would like to see further guidance, and we'd like to be involved in helping shape that guidance as well. I think as a practitioner myself, when you're involved in large-scale projects, we come at this often from a standpoint where we start very early, and early engagement with everybody is important. So if the guidance was to help set out what might be a minimum level of engagement for developers, I think that would be helpful. I think a lot of developers will want to do better, they'll want to achieve positive outcomes in their projects, and to do that you do need to be engaging early, you need to be considering good design and taking on all feedback from all stakeholders involved. But I think the worry is that without the requirement to do something, there might be a perception from local communities or objector groups that potentially developers might try and just sort of slide in under the radar, and I think there does need to be a minimum level of consultation or engagement set out.
And how might that interact? We've just been talking about the presumption of consent for critical national priority infrastructure. How do you think that new policy is going to interact with that? And do you think that the NPSs need to set out a strong expectation that consultation is still expected? Which then leaves the question, why remove the requirement in the first place?
I do think we still need to maintain the need to consult and engage. That's very important. And the NPSs do still refer to statutory consultation, so that change does need to come into effect. But I think the way we consult can be done better, to be more engaging and to obtain better feedback, to deliver more positive outcomes. I mean, I work in this field, we attend parish village halls and put up exhibition boards and talk to communities. And at that point in the statutory consultation process, as we alluded to earlier, the development is pretty much quite well shaped. Any changes that then come out of those discussions with communities can be done, but they are a considered approach. Whereas if you take that back a step and you come earlier in the process, before you've got a layout, potentially even, and you're looking at your parameters and your broad descriptors of the project, that is the time to really bring local communities and local authorities into the mix, because they have so much to offer that developers can find useful in the development of a project.
Okay. So could there be any further amendments to the NPSs that support the intent of the Planning Infrastructure Bill to consent projects faster and ensure smooth transition until those reforms come into force?
Yes, I think if there was clearer guidance on how the consultation stage would look, that would be useful to reference that and link to that guidance. Whether that guidance sits in the NPS itself, I'm not sure, but that could sit separately but be referred to.
Graham, do you have anything to add on this?
I mean, I concur with lots of things that Peter's said about it, and obviously the concern is to make developers do something or do, follow the guidance. I mean, one thought was that is it the fact that it's statutory guidance that's a problem, or is it the fact that what the statutory guidance has to be, with a preliminary environmental impact report and a statement of community consultation? If it was simplified down to the bare bones, or if it referred, to the fact that there'll be guidance which must, it probably doesn't work legalistically, but we need some hook to make sure that developers follow guidance. I mean, I know guidance does have a status, and generally speaking, in planning you follow guidance unless you've got a really good reason not to. But I guess there's just the fear that developments, especially now, wanting to get their applications in, will cut it to the bare minimum, and avoid a lot of the constructive dialogue that can be had.
Isn't it a mixed message coming from the government on this? If you still got, if they're taking it out, if they're making it not a requirement, but at the same time you're trying to set out how that guidance should, in your guidance, how it should.
I think it's the format. it is now. That's my view. I think it's the format of the statutory guidance. It's quite onerous on the developer and takes this huge amount of work behind it. It's a kind of application light, and should it be more like a consultation, an informal consultation? And certainly you want optioneering at the start with, probably quite broad brush. If it was an offshore wind farm, landing places and, substation locations, that type of stuff. And then obviously, a much more focused one on the actual chosen option. But, when you get into detailed consideration of impacts, it's going to be pretty difficult to change course. It's a bit of a straitjacket, I think, and I think it mitigates against being able to take on board the views of local communities. I think it's more of an instinct to say, no, we've got that covered, and carry on down the same path and defend what you've done, rather than saying, fair enough.
I'm a very strong advocate for proportionality in these cases as well. I mean, you do prepare an environmental statement or a preliminary environmental information report. It's vast, and the information in there is difficult to get to grips with and difficult to understand. And actually, how much help is it in shaping a project when you're speaking to communities and local authorities at that stage? It's all useful for examination because you need the evidence there to assess. But in the early stages, and in terms of good design and progress, proportionality is key, I think.
Lee, do you want to add anything on this?
Yes, I completely agree with the views expressed. I think in my understanding of the government's intention with the Planning and Infrastructure Bill was not to say that pre-application consultation wasn't important. It very much is very important, but to acknowledge that the Planning Act sets out these stringent requirements that are not leading to proportionate and meaningful consultation, and that therefore there is a better way of doing it. And my understanding is also there is intended to be guidance that accompanies those changes, and I think that'd be very beneficial. And I think it will be beneficial for communities as much as for applicants. I think the current system, as Graham and Peter have said, results in late consultation and a lot of documents that are very technical and are perhaps not read or understood by communities. And I don't think that's in the best interest of communities or the projects.
Thank you. So if we move on now to the question of grid connections, which obviously we discussed in the previous session, and if again I can start with Peter. So the National Infrastructure Planning Association has referred to misunderstandings emerging about the role of the regional capacity targets in the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan. What further clarity is needed?
Yes, thank you. And I know that was picked up in the earlier session with the earlier speakers, and Ali mentioned targets earlier as well. I think it's some of the wording, and in my written evidence we did submit some certain paragraph numbers that we would suggest some amendments to. The use of targets is misleading. It suggests that there are regional caps in areas where energy should be delivered, and actually we have a national need, and it's the national priority that needs to take precedent here. And we shouldn't cap or limit our ability to produce energy schemes until we have reached our national target, our national goal. So we shouldn't be restricting ourselves to targets in certain areas. There is a misconception that if a project is taking that region over their level, their target, that project then is not required, which is incorrect. All projects are required until we do meet our national need.
Okay. Perhaps we'll start with Graham for this one. Should the national policy statements give significant weight to the availability of a grid connection for a proposed project?
Yes, I think so. I think it's it's a critical part of the consideration. Local communities and local government are concerned about cumulative impacts, but also the typical environmental impacts of the grid connection. So if you think about offshore wind farms, onshore, the grid connection and the cable there too, that's the arena that the local communities and local government are really most interested in. So I think it's crucial. I think you need some clarity on that, because I think so much so much can pivot on that in terms of what comes next. Where is it? Is it in the right location for it? Which seemingly they're not often. They're not ideal. Nothing's ever perfect. To agree with that, but some are certainly suboptimal, and the whole developments that follow thereafter just exacerbate that situation. So it's critical. Yeah.
Isn't there a bit of a chicken egg thing here, in that the government is looking to prioritise new grid connections based on projects being ready to go, including having planning consent, but at the same time, if you give weight to the availability of existing grid connections, then those projects which don't currently have one are not going to get far enough forward that you then deliver the new connections.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be existing. I mean, we acknowledge that there's going to be new grid connections, either on existing or lines which haven't been built yet, and that's part of the equation. I mean, as I say, I think the grid connection side of things, I mean, that's absolutely critical for consideration. All the offshore stuff, that's the most impactful part of those, and even onshore as well. Obviously, you've got what follows next, solar farms or multiple solar farms or what have you. So it can be planned, and it's just that the planning needs to happen in a open and transparent way, and with consultation, and that consultation should be considered and acted upon. And
I just wonder whether we're sort of being entirely honest with ourselves, a very big us probably, about how feasible it is to have a really open planning system when it's non-planning considerations. I think this is really the essence of Claire's question. The non-planning considerations around what the developer's got ready, what land they have assembled, what grid connections are available. These are all non-planning considerations. In the end, how much influence does the planning process have?
So I mean, if you're talking first principles, a lot. So if there's options on the table and there's discussions about where a connection could be, for instance, that is a really crucial stage, and the arguments will be tabled, and it could mean that the connection is completely somewhere else, and then you've got your land assembly, and it's obviously there's feasibility within the grid itself, but those types of discussions can be had and have indeed been had in the past, not necessarily with the outcome that we wanted. But they certainly can be discussed at the early stages, and should be, because there might be a preferable area in our view that they should go to, and the local community thinks they should go to. I think if you've got a connection node in an area which is less controversial, the whole thing is going to work a lot better. You've got if you're just having a battle every single time with legal challenges, well, that's what can result from having a grid connection in an area which is suboptimal.
Thanks, Ali. Same sort of point.
Yeah, I mean, I think acknowledging that grid connections are a large driver for projects is beneficial in the national policy statements. I think there's probably not much need to go a lot further than that in national policy statements, because you do have the whole connections reform process, which determines the grid connection locations, and as you rightly say, planning doesn't have a lot of influence over that. But I think it does need to be taken into account, for example, when you're looking at a developer's optioneering, because that will be a factor in determining where projects come forward.
So, Peter, we've heard that objectives to infrastructure projects are already demanding site of commercial and grid connection agreements. Shouldn't this be necessary if grid connections are to be a relevant consideration?
The availability of a grid connection should carry significant weight, yes, in deciding where to place a project and in the feasibility for that project, because you need to be able to deliver that project. It has to connect. But the commercials behind that grid offer and how that sits, that we don't consider that to be part of the planning balance, and that's what's being asked by objectors.
And if we give significant weight to grid connection, is that not going to tip the balance even further in favour of infrastructure build and and raise concerns about overlooking environmental and other considerations?
I mean, you don't have a project if you can't connect it, so the availability of that grid connection is paramount. It is and should carry significant weight in planning. We then have to go into the optioneering of feasibility and environmental impact assessment and how the balance then carries through. But yes, in terms of site selection and in the planning balance, that connection is key.
Thank you.
Thank you. Talk, Crichton.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming in. I guess what we're dealing with here is this need to build this infrastructure for renewables for a low carbon tech and the impact it has on the environment and the places we live. And Peter, the guidance says that on this infrastructure says that anything deemed to be of critical national priority should not be kind of held back by environmental impacts. They're unlikely to be appropriate if they cause a material reduction in the generation and the capacity of renewables. Do we need clarification? Do we need to be more specific in that or have better guidance in that?
Yes, I mean, Ali touched on that earlier, in the word material being subject to discussion, and I think we all said that that's where the lawyers would love to get involved in how material something would be or not. I mean, in the design process for projects, good developers do take moves to reduce capacity if it's appropriate and necessary. And so as part of all of that feasibility and optioneering work that they do, that does come into the balance of whether then the project is deliverable in the long run. If that is a material reduction in capacity or not is probably a decision for the developer to take, because it could impact whether that project can actually be delivered and operational at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And finances are one of the big things there, I guess.
Yep, commercials, deliverability, and positive outcomes from that project too all need to be considered.
Graham, in the council, Suffolk County Council, you've had quite a lot of variation in what developers commit to protect nationally designated landscapes. What changes would you like to see in the planning statement to address?
Yes, I mean that's so we've had projects in and around national landscapes, and it's kind of a moving feast now. There's been cases such as the Lower Thames crossing, where I think the Secretary of State has agreed to put a requirement on the DCO about contributing to furthering the purposes, financially I'm talking about. I think it's the Kent Downs, and we're currently got 2 offshore wind farm applications. They actually don't land in Suffolk, but they're off the coast, and the substations are visible from the different national landscape as well, and they are quite resistant to that notion that anything other than the mitigation that they've already provided, which they have done, provided mitigation by reduction in the area of their offshore wind farm in one case, should be entertained. But on the other hand, we've got a current grid infrastructure project, and they are talking to us about essentially potentially providing funds to further the purposes of the national landscape, and how that manifests itself with, in lieu of the 100-metre wide swathe that will be cut across the landscape and obviously restored, that they would contribute towards the outcomes that are identified in the National Landscapes Management Plan. I think they've got 10 objectives, and that kind of offsets, or is considered to offset to some degree, the damage that's done, and anything that can, I think it, if there's a duty to further the purposes, some guidance on what that might entail would be beneficial.
Ali, should we just learn to live with this? I mean, turbines on the horizon, the planet's burning up. Shouldn't we just get on with it?
I think there always needs to be a balance, and these projects brought forward in the right way. I think I agree with Graham completely that some clarity about how the new duty on the Secretary of State to further the purposes of national landscapes and how that plays into the NSIP system would be really beneficial. I think one of the projects that I think Graham was referring to sort of illustrates kind of why I think clarity would be useful, which is, so Bramford to Twinstead, say overhead line consented last year, 29 kilometres, and essentially replacing an existing overhead line for the majority of it, a large section through an existing AOMB in that case, and placing it underground. So in the long term, the impacts on of the project on the AOMB were positive. You're taking an overhead line and you're placing a higher voltage underground. And there was a lot of debate in that examination that was quite interesting over the fact that you had a temporary construction impact on the AOMB during construction, and that impact is as a result of taking an overhead line and putting a new one underground and delivering these long-term benefits. And should there be financial compensation for that residual effect of that temporary construction impact? And I think we do need to think about how that plays out and make sure that we're thinking about that proportionally and how this really plays out in real projects, because that kind of clarity would avoid those discussions in examination.
Interesting. Peta, NEPA suggested that the national policy statement should be kind of future-proofed, so that there's reference to biodiversity net gain. What?
Yes.
What do we mean by this, and what would you add to that?
We are still waiting on a biodiversity net gain statement, and how that is then applied into NSIP projects. We're not there yet. We hear rumours, but nothing is forthcoming. So I think to future-proof the NPS for that statement coming out and the requirement for NSIPs to then provide a degree of biodiversity net gain, there should be
what would you put in the statement?
Tagline in there.
Or what would you put in the statement if you were to write?
10%.
Yeah, I think 10% is the sort of accepted percentage across the board and has been tested at examinations to date. That is part of government's aspiration, and that would be for a 30-year period, and we see NSIPs that are double that length in time, so it's how that then plays out going forward. We could suggest some wording to you if it would be helpful.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left, and I've got some final questions for you. Jackie Copley said in the first panel that a lot of mitigations which are promised are never delivered. To what extent do you think the policy documents should be changed to ensure mitigations are built? So whether Ali or Peter, Peter's looking at you, Ali. So.
Go first.
Yes, so I think this is a difficult thing to deliver through policy. The requirements on development consent orders are, you have to abide by those requirements, and I was very saddened to hear that those aren't being adhered to. That's obviously not good for the industry, and it's not good for communities. But I think we probably need to look at why that's happening and how it's enforced, but which I think it would be difficult for that to be tackled through policy.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree. I was deferring to Ali as a planner to see whether that would be the same view. I do agree. I think it comes down to the requirements in the DCO. I wonder, Graham, whether it's a local authority resourcing issue that potentially those requirements aren't being monitored or checked.
The one that the examples that spring to mind. So you get sometimes so you've got linear projects, for instance, or cables or overhead lines. And one way to mitigate that would be to reinforce off-site planting, and they've kind of often been done under Section 111 of the Local Government Act 1972, sort of miscellaneous provisions, or a hybrid with a 106. And what that needs is, even though the monies might be provided, it needs a landowner to agree to do it. Which they often don't. So it's, I've got colleagues running around saying, well, where the skylight plot's going to go, or where's the planting going to go? Don't know, nobody wants to do it, it's a problem. And I just wonder, sometimes guidance, I can understand industry's reticence, who wants more control in the commercial side of things. Of course you don't, but I'm just wondering if guidance to, help developers say that they, within their order limits, they need to identify off-site mitigation where necessary might be helpful, because once it's in the DCO, it's likely to happen. And it's maybe not what landowners want to hear, but that's one particular route, because it is a slight issue. So what you end up with is mitigation along the route, or around a cable ceiling end compound, but not much else, where it could be quite beneficial. But obviously there are strict restrictions around compulsory acquisition, that you only really should do what you really have to do. There's no alternative. So it might be of use.
Okay, thank you. We have a very short period left. I'm going to ask a massive question about whether solar farms are a threat to our food security.
To me? Or
as you've spoken, you can answer first.
Okay. So there's an issue, isn't there, about best and most versatile land, grades 1, 2 and 3 of agricultural land classification. We've got 2 projects at the moment that are coming forward. They're both on best and most versatile land. And what would be helpful is if there's a kind of a strategic direction to what the response should be. So obviously these are in place for typically 40 years. Takes B&V out of the circulation for 40 years. I acknowledge that it can actually benefit the land in the long term. That could be part of the strategy and the argument. And I acknowledge that for rural farm diversification, it's very beneficial to the landowner. We acknowledge that. So I think a steer in guidance as to how to consider it would be very useful.
Okay, and Ali, are there changes that should be made to the national policy statements to address this and to get the balance right between food and energy security?
Yes, to my understanding, even the most ambitious targets for solar are not determined to have a significant impact on food security. That's what the reports are saying that I've read. And if that's the case, then why not state it in the national policy statement? And I've been part of examinations for several large-scale solar farms, and in all of them there has been an argument about the impact on food security, and a lot of discussion and written questions and evidence that's produced, and in each case the conclusion has been the same, that actually the impact of those particular schemes, the impact on B&V was acceptable, and food security was not taken as a wider material planning consideration.
Peta, if you agree, then you just need to say so. If you
fully agree. I mean, the NPS does state that the land type is not the predominating factor in determining whether a project is suitable.
This moves on to my final question, which is the idea of a precedent system for NSIP decisions similar to case law, say that examining authorities do not need to reinvent the wheel every time arguments like this one are raised and can rely on previous decisions instead. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think that's done already. Mm. I think already both sides will find examples from previous decisions and use them as examples. I think projects are really diverse in terms of their nature and where they are in context. So I think it's quite difficult to say.
There's no need to formalise reference to this.
In my view, I think there's no need.
Great. Anybody any different view to that? No.
I think clarification on the agricultural land point would be helpful. It is something that crops up very often at examination. I've been involved in examinations in Lincolnshire, for example, which is host to a lot of solar schemes, and that always crops up. And if there was a definitive line, I think that would be very helpful for both objectors and applicants.
Graham, anything to add finally?
No, I think that's fair enough. It's like Ali says, you know, the cases are similar but different, but I do agree with Peter that on the agricultural solar issue, I think it's doable, and I think what that would require would be some analysis of, you'd have to do an analysis of what's out there and what the impact is and what the strategy is.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our session. So Peter Donkin, Ali, Leeder, Graham, Gunby, thank you all very much for your evidence and for contributing to our inquiry.
Thank you.
That's the end of the session. Order.